Hello and welcome to the video podcast series of Zoho Contracts. I'm Akhil, a customer experience lead with Zoho Contracts, and today we have with us Gemma Nugent, a contract management expert and the principal lawyer at Sound Legal Australia. Gemma is here with us today to share her insights on the contract management challenges in the construction industry and the best practices to overcome them. In this conversation, she also touches upon the effect of the pandemic on contract management, the key skills contract managers need to have, the role of technology in contract management, and much more. So sit back and enjoy this engaging and informative conversation with Gemma. Gemma, welcome to Zoho Contracts. We are really excited to have you here, and we are looking forward to hear your insights, Gemma. Gemma, as an expert, as a legal expert in the construction and the real estate industry, so what are the key contract management challenges that you have observed over the years?
Well, I would say the biggest contract challenges that I see in construction contracts, I actually don't do too much with real estate contracts, but construction contracts, I'd say there's three things that come up over and over again. The first is defining the scope of the works. So who is doing what, when is it going to be done by, how much is it going to cost? And that's really about managing both parties' expectations. So really getting to grips with what is the scope of the work, what's the specification, what's the quality or the specific requirements of what needs to be done, and getting that right really is probably the most important thing. In some ways, it's more important than getting the legal stuff right, because the better the job that the parties have done in defining the scope, the more likely that they're going to get a great project outcome at the end of the project. And really, that's usually what a construction project is all about. So that's number one, getting the scope right. Number two is managing change. So when the scope, and so you have to get number one right for number two to work. And often, because number one is often not done that well, the scope of works is often not done that well, that makes it really hard to negotiate changes to the scope. And so that is a real area of challenge for both the principal, the project owner, and the builder or the designer of the building, because if there's no process for deciding, well, we've changed our minds about what this, if we're the project owner, we've changed our minds, or perhaps the nature of the project has changed for some reason, perhaps we couldn't get the building approval we needed, or whatever, for whatever reason, the project owner decides that they have to change the scope, or and this has very much been an issue in the construction industry in Australia, perhaps there's a supply chain delay and the particular product that was going to be used to, the air conditioner isn't available. So is there a substitute, and how are we going to manage that? So managing change and what that means for the scope, the price, and the timing of the project. And that leads me on to the third biggest challenge for construction contracts, which is managing the program, which has also been a major issue, certainly in Australia, and I think in other nations as well over the last couple of years, because we've had in Australia very, very tight labour market, so real shortages in labour, and also real interruptions in our supply chains. And the outcomes of that for a project are it's just a supply and demand proposition. And so, projects are running late, and it's not always the construction or the contractor's fault, but the project owner might have really signed them up to do something by a particular period of time, and it becomes more and more difficult to do that. And if the contract doesn't have a process for deciding how program is going to be managed, that can really sour the relationship between the parties as well. So your question was, what are the biggest challenges for construction projects from a contractual point of view? And my answer is getting the scope of works right, managing changes to the project, and managing changes to the program, so managing the time of the project. I think those are the three biggest challenges that I see in construction contracts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gemma. So are there any challenges which are specific to your region? So again the challenges in contract management specific to your
in
yes,
Western Australia.
yeah.
I've probably already flagged them. The biggest challenges to contract management in Western Australia at the moment are labour shortages. So, during the pandemic, the Australian, both federal government and the in Australia, we have a multi-level government. So we have the federal government and the state government. We have a number of state governments in Australia, and I'm in Western Australia. And so both the federal government and the West Australian government elected to shut the borders in Australia, and that had a massive impact on the labour market. And so there's sort of a convergence of various things that has really acted to tighten the supply of both skilled and unskilled labour, which, has an obvious knock-on effect in the construction industry and for managing contracts. And the second thing that is really has been a massive challenge in the last certainly 18 months, maybe out to 2 years, and is also really, it's a convergence of things, but very much driven by the pandemic, was this massive supply chain interruption. So in Australia, there's a few different things that are affecting that, but it just takes so much longer to get materials than it did in the past. And it's really unpredictable. You just sort of don't know how long it's going to take to get things. And then during that time, we have massive inflation in Australia at the moment. And so, the builder might have signed up for a lump sum fixed price building contract 2 years ago or whatever. And during that period, the cost of materials and the cost of labour has gone up, in some cases as much as 30-40%. And so trying to manage a contract and keep the builder afloat is a real challenge. And from the builder's point of view, trying to manage a contract where, it's even breaking even, never mind making a profit, is a real challenge. And that's the reason why there are labour shortages and supply chain interruptions in Western Australia at the moment.
Yeah, Gemma. So you spoke about the pandemic. Could you elaborate that a bit further? I mean, what changes have you observed, and what strategies the organizations used to mitigate the impact of the pandemic?
Oh, wow, that's a big
With respect
question.
to contract management, of course.
So for contract management, I think, we went through a period in Western Australia where the state government imposed some fairly onerous restrictions on how people could work. And as it happens, the construction industry was mostly accepted from that. So for the most part, the government considered that construction was an essential service, and that so people, as much as in many other industries, people were asked to stay at home and work from home. Construction people were still going to the building site. However, most construction contracts that were signed, commercial at any rate, construction contracts that were signed during that period had like COVID mitigation strategies. So the parties would, and I saw this in various ways. So some people would just sort of throw it into the force majeure clause and say, look, if something happens that causes us to this project to have to be suspended for a time, we'll just use the force majeure clause. And that can work in some instances. In Australia, the force majeure regime, as a general rule, allows the parties some relief as to time, but not as to costs. So usually the builder is still taking the risk of the cost of the escalation of costs and other cost implications of force majeure suspension, but they will not be exposed to liquidated damages because the project will be suspended. The time during which it can be performed will be extended. I don't think that works anymore because, as a general rule, like force majeure is a creature of contract, and as a general rule, the kind of triggers for that are that the cause couldn't be reasonably foreseeable at the time that the contract was entered into. And we can no longer really say that about COVID delays. And so I think the contracts that are better placed to mitigate the outcomes of COVID delays were the ones where the parties actually came up with a dedicated COVID strategy and said, look, if the state government brings in, or COVID causes supply chain delays, here's how we propose to manage it. We'll let you know this, and then we'll decide this, and then you'll give a direction, and here's how costs changes to scope, time and costs will be managed. Then, like with anything, then the parties have, like at a time when they still like each other and they're excited about the project, they've come up with a process that then the contract manager can use to manage those situations. So that's probably the best way that I see them mitigated. I have to say now, we're a couple of years down the track and well, you never know what will happen, but it seems a little bit unlikely that the government would bring in regulations that would cause a big project to be suspended, but we are still experiencing these massive supply chain delays. And so I would say as a construction lawyer, I've been working in the construction industry for about 13 years, I think. And this is the first time that I've actually seen people negotiating escalation clauses into contracts. So in the past in Western Australia, it was conventional for there to be no rise and fall for for any contemplation of escalation of costs to be completely excluded. But in the last 12-ish months, I think, the builders have a little bit more negotiating power and they're in a better position to say to project owners, costs are going up, costs of labour and supplies and materials are going up, and we need a way of dealing with that in our contract. And so we're either going to move away from the lump sum delivery model and use a different delivery model, which might be, cost plus or whatever, or we need some way of negotiating when, costs are escalating, how will that be managed? And that's a little bit like that COVID idea. Like if at the start of the project, the parties are able to say, look, there's some unknowns in this project. There's some things that might happen or might not happen. And let's talk now about what the process should be for dealing with those things. And then the contract manager is in a position to say, right, well, that risk that we were worried about is happening now, let's exercise or press go on that process for managing the risk, whether that's COVID or cost escalation or whatever it might be.
Okay, Gemma. So can you give a specific instance where, for example, there was a contract dispute and an effective contract management help overcome the dispute and your learnings from that?
So what's a specific example? So in Western Australia at the moment, I think there's a lot of construction projects that are between, 4 and as much as 12 months delayed, like they're behind where their program was. And I actually do have one great client who I really like, which is they're a landscaping business. So they do, commercial landscaping for big projects. Yeah. And they signed up to a contract with a builder whereby they had to place orders for the plants. And the intention was that the plants, let's say that, for the sake of this story, the plants were intended to be put in the ground in May, which is the beginning of winter in Australia. And the project was delayed by 6 months. And so the orders were placed. The orders for these plants were placed, and they took some time for them to get to a point where they could be, actually planted. And the project was delayed by 6 months, which would have meant, firstly, that the plants that had already been planted would no longer be at the right stage to be put in the ground. And secondly, they're now going to be planted at the beginning of the Australian summer, which is pretty hardcore. So the party, and there was no real logical, it was really hard to kind of think about, like, is this, what we think of as a qualifying cause of delay? Like, is this the kind of situation that the parties think about as justifying an extension of time or a change to the costs of the project? And it sort of didn't fall neatly into either the time management provisions or the variation provisions, because I can't remember how it was going to be managed, but, either the plants had to be stored and then there was going to be additional work to be done to plant them at this different time of the year. And so the scope didn't really-itemize that stuff out that well. And so my client tried to use the variation process to manage that issue. And so there's the contract managers, I guess, from both parties are talking to each other there. And they're so you've got a head contractor and a subcontractor. And they're trying to use the variation process, and it wasn't quite working. And so they ended up actually having to really sit down and just nut it out. And that's an option that sometimes people don't take, right? They're like, oh, well, this isn't a variation, so it's off the table. Oh, well, they tried to work through the variation process. That didn't quite work. And so the two parties sat down and spoke to each other, and, and the builder and the principal, so the project owner, agreed that it was no fault of the landscaping contractor that this had happened. And so the costs had to be, ultimately the costs were of the project. And so they were able to they was kind of able to adapt the variation process, if you like, to manage their way through that. And I think that would be quite typical of a lot of projects in Western Australia at the moment, but it's a little bit unusual because of the plants. Like, it's a bit different to other building materials, which are bricks or, taps or whatever that can be just left in a warehouse for a while. The plants had this kind of life cycle that was different. So, yeah.
Yeah, great example. So, what advice would you give to contract managers? I mean, what are the important skills, the key skills that the contract managers need to have in the construction industry? And also, how can organizations help their teams develop these skills?
So contract management can be really complex because you are managing all these different things, and potentially, you might not be an engineer or a builder. You might have, come up through the ranks, or you might have been off to uni and done a degree in construction management or whatever. I think it can be really helpful for construction managers to actually spend some time on site and see how things work. And that's the same as, construction lawyers, like actually going out to site and seeing, like, how does this work in practice? When there's a variation order that goes out, where does it go? Like, who actions it, and how is it recorded, and how do the parties report on it to each other? And if I'm the contract manager and I'm putting together a contract and I have a time frame of X days for someone to notify a delay, like, is that actually going to be achievable in practical terms? And so you might need to go and actually talk to people on the actual builders, the people who are going to, not just the estimators in the building firm, but the project manager or the site manager, and understand how those things happen. Even if they only do that on one or two projects, I think that can really give them some insight into what it's like being on site versus, beavering away in the office with a contract management, system. But I think certainly upskilling on contract management, it's a broad brush. It's not just like how does a variation clause work, or how does an extension of time clause work. It's how do I put together a contract management team, and where do I fit in that team, and what skills do we need? Like, do we need someone who can manage the budget and the cash flow of the project? Do we need someone who can manage the program, which is a very special skill, like someone who can put together a program and manage it over time, and see how, particularly for complex commercial projects, like if this bit gets delayed, can we resequence around it, or is that actually on the critical path and it's going to put a stop to everything? Like, how can that be managed? So, if it's a really complex project, perhaps you've got some different skill sets in your contract management team. If it's a smaller project and you're the only contract manager, I think it is really getting some of those practical skills, and that might mean literally going to site and just kind of having a chat with people about how the project's going to be delivered and what that means for managing the contract. In Western Australia, we do have, and I'm sure everywhere else, we have professional learning kind of offerings. And in fact, I facilitate some contract management courses at the Australian Institute of Management in WA. And I know those always have really good feedback. Like, people are kind of like, wow, I'd always wondered why the contract said that, and now I get it. And so that's a little bit of a mix of maybe speaking to a lawyer or a commercial manager about how a contract is put together, and also at the other end to the builder and the people on the site about, how does this work? What's going on when a building is getting built, or, whatever, a road, a bridge.
Gemma, so how do you foresee the future of contract management in the construction industry? And how do you think it will impact the industry as a whole in future?
So I think we're a little way away from it yet, but I think there's huge potential in AI, and, ChatGPT, of course, is a really hot topic for everyone at the moment. But I do think there's enormous potential for us to move from these kind of analog transactional documents into something that is more digital, a better digital product. And probably contract management systems are the pathway to that. So being able to, I don't know, have some kind of holistic model of the project that the contract speaks to, so that, and that's a little bit like my idea about, the program management. Like, if this bit of the project changes, how does that affect other pieces? If there's a variation, conventional construction contracts in Australia, a lot of the time they manage variations and extensions of time separately, even though the two things often are directly linked. So a more holistic sort of digital means of managing, like smart contracts or whatever. And, I think the construction industry is very transactional, and it's very old fashioned. And I think it's hard to see the pathway from where we are now to some kind of future digital model. But I think we will get there. And that's what I think the future is. And I think that the outcome of that is what we all want, which will be better project outcomes. We'll have projects that are more likely to be delivered on time and on budget, and that also frees up more thinking for innovation. Like, is there a different way we could build this thing? Are there ways that we can maximize its usefulness to the people who ultimately will use the building or the structure or whatever it is? That's, I guess, my vision for the future of contracts in the construction industry, and I really look forward to getting there. I don't think it'll be in the next year or two, but I think it's coming.
Yeah, so you spoke about technology. So how do you see technology playing a role in contract management? I mean, in the immediate future.
So in the immediate future, of course, we do have contract management systems which are helpful.
Okay.
I think they're only as good as the data that gets put into them, including the actual construction contract and the processes that are in there. Okay. And so I think the more user-friendly they become, both contracts and the contract management software, the better they are going to get us along that path to the really great project outcome. I think sometimes, in my experience, contract management systems are pretty technical, and so people will just avoid using the technical parts of them. And so I think as technology advances, one of the really great advantages of that is creating software and systems that are, machine learning is a really good example of this, right? Like, so if they're able to say, right, well, on this project, they're always putting the variation claim in 2 days late, like, can we shift the program to account for that? Or I don't know, like, the notion that there can be some kind of software that can anticipate problems and perhaps flag them for the contract manager and say, this looks like it's about to run late on this part, and if you resequence this bit now, that's going to overcome that issue. Like, those sorts of functions, if you like, are what help builders make more profit, a better margin, and the project owner get a better outcome. And that's really those are some of the major goals, I think, for stakeholders in this industry.
Yeah, Gemma. So if we speak about contract management software now, to give an example, like Zoho Contracts, that gives you granular visibility into the contracts. It helps you track and manage all your obligations. And with contract data, it gives you lots of analytics, lots of reports, insights, which is kind of actionable for the businesses to take decisions. So will that help?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. If you look at a commercial builder over time, they've got heaps of that data, right? Like, they've got that data, but they can't extract it or manipulate it. They don't know how to manage it. And so they can't really use that data to help them price the next price and schedule the next job. So to the extent that, the software helps to predict or to flag things that are coming up that's already helpful. It helps to manage like vast amounts of information that's going backwards and forwards, like, the price payment claims and variation claims and extensions of time, whatever. Like, those are hard to manage anyway, particularly on a complex project. And so having software that makes that process easier is, of course, an advantage. But I also think that notion of collecting data in a way that can be used for future projects is also a big advantage. And I think that is another step on that path to, my vision of contracts that are more holistic and less of an analog transactional document. That's what I think.
So the future seems exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Gemma, so I mean, if you look at contracts, so there are lots of legal and regulatory changes. So how do organizations keep themselves updated with these regulatory changes with respect to contracts? And what resources do they have, especially in your region, that is Australia, that can help them with this?
That actually is a bit tricky. Look, I think there's probably less. No, there's a lot of legislation that affects the construction industry, and I think in Western Australia we've seen reforms in both. We have security of payment legislation in all Australian jurisdictions, but in Western Australia that was reformed. The reforms started coming into effect last year, and in Western Australia as well, we've had some reforms to the occupational health or the work health and safety legislation, which affect construction contracts. And I think, like, having a great relationship with either a lawyer like me or a commercial manager who advises on this kind of stuff, those are the sort of people that hopefully will be reaching out to their clients and saying, hey, did you know that this has changed and your contracts might need to be updated and your systems also might need to be updated because you're going to have different obligations, either to the other party to the contract or to the state government. So having great advisors in your team, like having that network of professionals that support you, is helpful. And there's plenty of, like, certainly in Western Australia, the state government is pretty good at having information that's available about that stuff. But if you don't have that professional network of advisors or access to information about that stuff, you're not really going to know that it's there. So I really think the answer to that is having great people in your team, in your, wider, not just inside your business, although bigger businesses certainly are supported by in-house legal and commercial teams. But if your business isn't big enough to have those people in the team, then it's, having a network. And I don't know, I mean, some contract management software, I imagine, is able to integrate this stuff, but it's still only going to be as good as the data that's put into it. And so you do need advisors to say, well, it's time to think about, the safety and design obligations, or, what's happening, how we allocating risk for work health and safety in our project and things like that. Like, I think, we can't all know everything. And so sometimes it's about knowing what you don't know. So, I'm a builder, and security of payment legislation isn't really my top topic that I want to read about. So I've got to ring Gemma or, Zoho or whoever to make sure that I'm getting the right professional support to make sure that I'm doing the right thing, and also that I'm pricing the compliance with that stuff into my project as well.
Yeah, Gemma. So contract management software do help with lots of insight, but still it won't take away the roles of advisors. The roles of advisors are really needed.
I think that's right.
Yeah, Gemma, could you throw some light on the ethics aspect of contract management in the construction industry?
Oh, that's a good question as well. So I think most big construction companies and big project owners, they have ethical obligations that come from a variety of sources. So, if they're listed on the public stock exchange in Australia, then their shareholders are going to put pressure on them to act as good corporate citizens. There are obligations to do the right thing in various pieces of legislation in Australia, and also construction industry stakeholders in Australia who have partners or corporate siblings in other jurisdictions like the US and the UK, there's quite, rigorous anti-bribery and anti-corruption legislation that will actually has extraterritorial jurisdiction, so it does affect businesses in Australia. So businesses definitely need to be thinking about this and doing the right thing. And we also have modern slavery, which goes together with that. That's something that the Australian Parliament, the Australian government, and businesses have thought a little bit more lately, exploring the integrity of their supply chain and trying to make sure that their suppliers all the way down the line are doing the right thing. So how do we manage that with contracts? Sometimes I think we're a bit complacent with this sort of thing. Like we just throw in a few clauses in the contract, like everyone has to, observe the code of conduct and commit to like issuing a modern slavery report. And that is one way of managing it. I don't think that's really, I'm not sure that I think sometimes people think, right, I've ticked that box, that I've complied with that requirement and I don't have to think about it anymore. But I think actually, particularly for listed companies, the shareholders will start to really demand a bit more attention to that stuff. And so it might be time to start thinking about, well, yes, we need to have that in our contract, but we also need to make sure we're actually taking action to do the right thing and, making sure that probably the easiest way is to make sure our commercial partners are people that we really trust and believe in and believe also have an ethical approach to business. It's worthwhile having those clauses in the contract, but I don't think that's enough. I think the parties and stakeholders need to be taking some more active steps to ensure that both they and their suppliers are doing the right thing.
Yeah. Thanks, Gemma. So finally, Gemma, what advice would you give to organizations who would want to improve their contract management processes? What steps would they need to follow?
Look, I think the very first thing is to actually have a bit of an audit of what contracts you're using in your business. I think as businesses grow and do more and more projects, they tend to collect this sort of library of contracts. All of them might sort of have slightly different focuses or slightly different risk allocations. And so from time to time, it's a really good idea to sit down and say, look, what contracts are we using in the business? And is it time that we really had our commercial team or our legal team have a look at them and make sure that they're up to date for legislation and ethical obligations and various other things. But also have we like bolted on a whole lot of contract management processes that we don't really need or that aren't really appropriate and that are making life harder? So that's step one, like have a clean up. Conduct an audit and clean up your contracts that you're using in your business. And then secondly, that should put you in good stead to then make sure that they are working with your contract management system, and that your contract management system, if you're using one, and probably most businesses are, that you're able to, plug those processes into the contract management system and have it, help you run the project. So help you flag deadlines and, manage the cash flow and do all of those great things that contract management software does, always with, that objective in mind of a great project outcome. Like the project owner gets a great building, the builder makes some money, the parties want to go on and work together in future. Contract management system plays a pretty big role in that. And it's only going to work well if you've got the contract right to start with.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Gemma. Thanks for your time. And your perspectives were really insightful.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day.